So I only tell you that there is a serious mistake in in some of the copies, not in all of them, but some of the very first copies that we send around have a mistake in section 2, page 1, in the last line of the first paragraph. Instead of the ratman, of course, it should say the wolfman. So I think I will call on Dr. Valenstein, who happened to be the chairman of a similar panel in New York. Was it in New York?
Yes.
Yeah. Last December, and I think he can give us a pretty good summary of what happened there, and this probably is a very good introduction to our meeting today. You know, I really want this to be very informal, so do please feel free to talk freely and interrupt and so on, so that we can have a proper exchange of ideas. It will be very nice if you come to the microphone and give your name and the place where you come from, so that we can have this recorded. It's being tape recorded, and it will be very nice if we know who said what and so on for the record, yes? Dr. Valenstein? Before you start, could I have somebody from our group at the Hampstead Clinic to take minutes as well, please? Thank you.
When Dr. Nagera wrote to me, it came as a rather welcome and timely surprise in a way, because it so happened that we had a panel discussion at the American Psychoanalytic last December, which had been actually set up sometime previously, and which had an intention born out of an interest in the curiosity of the Hampstead Clinic. So it's almost circular that it comes back in some form now to the Hampstead Clinic too, that we set a topic up which was to investigate, or at least to discuss as far as we could, what we call genetic determinants of obsessive compulsive phenomena in character formation. Now, this calls for a certain footnote, really. We styled the topic in this book to discuss necessarily neuroses, but to leave ourselves well open to the issue of normal development or pathological development. In other words, to try to see whether we could discuss in some concrete or at least meaningful way those phenomena in normal development and in pathological development from the earliest time, from the earliest positions really, which conceivably might connect with certain strengths in character development which we would see as, I would say, normally systematizing, but also might connect, conceivably, with what later becomes obsessional neurosis. Now, I thought what I might do is to recapitulate to some extent my introduction, and not necessarily to go into some aspects of the discussion which might come up more fruitfully in the course of the evening. But I tried to set the panel off perhaps in the most difficult direction, namely the direction of phenomenologic manifestations which suggested what we thought of as proto-obsessive determinants, manifesting themselves in obsessive or compulsive-like features of behavior, perhaps before the anal phase, and sometimes as early as the point when the pre-verbal period gives way to beginning speech. There was a certain speculation in this, that perhaps there was a rootedness in obsessionalism which antedates, in a way, the anal phase and conflict at that time, that there was something from the constitutional side which might determine a specific line of development. It touched then, this topic, on the issue of the complementary series of heredity and environment, and reminded us, by the way, that in analysis we use the word genetic usually, not quite in keeping with the biological approach, in which the word genetics concerns itself with heredity and constitutional variations, the genic aspect, as it were, but that we generally think of genetic as being an explanatory hypothesis in terms of origin, development, and causal antecedents in a broader sense. Not that these are mutually exclusive. The issue of the role of constitutional factors in character development and neurogenesis did not really become central until Freud published Analysis Terminable and Interminable, when, with its emphasis on the innate variations in the strengths of the instincts and in the constitution of the ego. For one thing, what was in mind was this very question of what is the really problem for development facing a child who might be born with a superfluity of instinctual impulsion, with a very heavy charge in his instinctual organization, whether there is something in this that presents him with a problem in development in terms of his ego before the anal phase sets in. The question was whether this panel that we had at that time might usefully consider character development as it antedates conflict and remains outside of conflict, and to furthermore consider what in character is modifiable through analysis and what is not. As we put it, I said we were very much concerned nowadays with the issue of what are the givens in character development, not only because of the stimulation of Hartman's ideas of primary autonomous ego functions and an epigenetic scheme of ego development, but also because of certain appropriate restraints which we exert upon ourselves with regard to our therapeutic expectations. After all, we are distinctly guarded with respect to the possibility of major transformations in character. On the whole, we do not expect, we don't expect anyway, an obsessive character, to put it in the extreme, to end up a hysteric. And we don't expect an obsessive to change the essential styling of his character, but we do hope that with a successful analysis, he will achieve a resiliency that he didn't possess before and no longer be bound by conflicts at an unconscious level. But it presents the issue of style, of character response, which we had the feeling might move before and outside of the range of conflict, and again, before perhaps the anal phase, and somewhat an additional or a different perspective than the traditional thought of regression from phallic genital level to anal phases of development. What we realized was that it was much easier to pick out pathological mechanisms from the analyses of adults and children than to discern their anlaga before conflict sets in and sweeps up what was already underway in a normal developmental form, that there is really a paucity of data derived from the direct observation of children who are relatively normal, or from that period of conflict which antedates the intrapsychic, that period of development which antedates intrapsychic conflict. The assumption was that there are primary congenital variations in the ego which substantially determine sequential lines of development and which contribute significantly to the later specificity of character. There were three possible approaches to the study of these problems as I formulated it. Through the concepts and developmental hypotheses based on current psychoanalytic theory, through the direct observation of children, and through reconstruction from the analyses of adults and children. Hopefully, all three avenues would be used in our deliberations. And we had a certain good fortune in that regard, and yet a certain limitation. One of the presentations, it's a paper which will be read at this meeting by Dr. Ramsey, was his discussion of factors and features of an early compulsive formation, and it really followed, to a very large degree, a fairly traditional presentation of conflicts even beyond at the anal phase and thereafter, which caused the child to fall back upon anal problems. The second was, however, and this is also curiously enough to be presented in a related way at these meetings, a presentation by Dr. Sanford Gifford, who'd been studying identical twins from birth and studying the pattern of their response and the difference in their response and trying to discern their predilections in one or another direction. Well, perhaps that's enough to begin. In some regards, I think our speculation may not be quite in keeping with some of your impressions that obsessional phenomenologic behavior does not necessarily presage obsessive character formation or obsessional neurosis. Somehow we had the feeling that it might.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valenstein. I think we can discuss some of your points later on. Perhaps we first go through the different speakers this evening and then come back to the different points in the different expositions. I think I would call now Dr. Myerson. I can tell you the following. Dr. Myerson already presented a very interesting contribution in the same meeting that you have heard now Dr. Valenstein referred to, and I think he will partly present us tonight with some of his work in this connection. He has for a long time now been concerned with this particular aspect as we are, so I like very much what I read, though I don't know the full paper, I know the summary, and we will have now the opportunity to enlarge on it.
Well, this paper is somewhat different, but it includes some of the same ideas. A rigid control of instinctual impulses is an important aspect of the obsessive-compulsive syndrome, which distinguishes it from other psychiatric disorders. I will differentiate between the clinical features and the obsessive-compulsive conditions that result from early and from later modes of control, and I will also try to conceptualize the difference between control and mastery as it pertains to certain phenomena associated with this syndrome. I'll start with a very broad definition to which I welcome amendments. The compulsive individual has been exposed to overstimulation at an early age, remains tied to infantile modes of gratification and object choices, and most significantly for the present purposes, manifests in one form or another excessive measures of control. The excessive measures of control impair in a special way his capacity to respond to those forces within himself or in his environment that otherwise would promote healthy maturation. Major steps towards establishing control occur in the anal period. The impetus for this step is provided by the markedly increased capacity of the child for distinguishing between himself and the outer world, for tuning in, as it were, to the cues emanating from the key figures in his outer world as they help him find controls. Quite apart from the influence of maturation, there are a number of more or less familiar factors that intensify the impetus towards control, frequently to the point where an excessive tendency to control impedes the normal psychological growth of the child. Excessive frustration or excessive stimulation of all types necessitates excessive control if any development is to occur. Excessive parental urgings for control further the child's tendency to control himself and his world in a rigid fashion. Precocious ego development, insofar as the child very early in his life recognizes that certain impulses are unacceptable to his parents, has been suggested as an etiological factor in the genesis of premature and rigid control, and so forth. What methods does the very young child have for controlling the dangers that appear to beset him, both from within himself and from the outside? The very young child probably has only a minimal sense that he's controlling anything, as we ordinarily use the expression. Things may become controlled by his various maneuvers, but as far as one can gauge the character of a child's mind, he's more interested initially in evading, immobilizing, getting rid of dangers, and so forth. The idea that one can control through one's own efforts oneself or someone else dawns more gradually. This line of argument obviously needs considerable amplification, but the semantic difficulty resulting from the several meanings of the word control is sometimes confusing. A partial list of measures that the pre-Oedipal child has for dealing with his apparent dangers that seem to have a bearing upon the obsessive-compulsive syndrome include attempts to control, using this term loosely, the object as distinct from controlling the self, either through actual manipulative measures or by way of fantasies that involve the use of projective identification, withdrawal from the object to a state of omnipotent invulnerability with a parapasso devaluation of the object, measures involving more concern for the object through which the child attempts to control his own impulses in an effort to protect the object. For example, compliancy to the object's desires as one mode of dealing with his concern lest he damage or lose the object. Undoubtedly, the potentially obsessive child uses all these varied measures of defense to some extent during the early critical periods of his development. The extensive use, however, of one or the other method of controlling danger has a vast import for the subsequent history of the child. The potentially compulsive child who has concern for the object, although the word concern again admittedly poses semantic difficulties, and attempts to control his own impulses, generally has a much more favorable outlook than the potentially compulsive child who tends to control in a megalomaniac fashion and to devaluate his threatening objects. Through the deployment of these various measures aimed at controlling, or at least defending against his inner chaos, the potentially compulsive child becomes shut off from very vital growth-promoting forces within himself and his environment. Rycroft has emphasized that reality testing and imagination ordinarily function together in an integrated fashion. In the obsessive child, imagination loses its adaptive potential. It can no longer serve as a useful temporary means for solace in frustrating circumstances, nor can imaginative processes aid the child as he feels his way in relating to his milieu. Imagination instead becomes an instrument of terror, evoking still more frantic defensive measures. Moreover, the special types of involvement the obsessive child has for his objects, his need to control them, and in particular his awareness that they want him to control himself, impairs his capacity for empathy and his ability to interpret correctly the healthier aspects of his object's feelings for him. This last point will be amplified when I discuss the distinction between control and mastery. An outstanding feature of the potentially compulsive child, manifests very early in his life, is his tendency toward concreteness. Overwhelming emotional experiences become for him too painful to tolerate, and he strives to isolate them from awareness. He attempts to organize himself and his objects or their parts as if they were discrete entities to be manipulated. Dangers are by this means immobilized, extruded, in a certain sense controlled. He delineates these entities largely in terms of bodily functions or in terms which have very simple connotations, goodness, badness, and so forth. Because of his immaturity, he is unable to comprehend more complex causal relationships between himself and the key people in his milieu. The extent of concreteness manifest by different compulsive individuals in adult life varies considerably, undoubtedly markedly influenced by the age at which and the intensity with which affect was experienced and subsequently controlled. For example, Edith Jacobson describes the analysis of a predominantly compulsive man who structured his own behavior and others' behavior in what she termed a semi-concrete manner. Awareness of his own and other persons' emotional responses was conspicuously lacking, and he dealt with aspects of himself and others as if they were entities. He would, to cite one instance, make a smile appear on the face of his wife by his smile-evoking behavior, rather than affectively appreciate how he and his wife were reacting in a situation that ordinarily would be associated with all kinds of intense feeling. In the more extreme cases, this characteristic is at the root of the severe types of projective and introjective identifications manifest by borderline characters or psychotics. In milder manifestations, it's difficult to distinguish concreteness from the compulsive mechanisms, which are the more prominent measures of defense later on in life. As the child grows older, his mental processes become more complex. For example, his sense that he can and should control himself and his objects becomes more clearly developed, and indeed the pleasure he gains from such control more apparent. the child increasingly becomes aware of what it means to control oneself and one's object. As he grows older, of course, he enters the Oedipal period of his life and is confronted with new dangers that place new strains upon his methods of defense and control. As he grows older, his parents sometimes take new attitudes towards what he should or should not control, and he reacts in new ways to their edicts. This combination of factors, the maturation of the mental apparatus, the new instinctual conflicts, the new reaction to new parental attitudes, influences the clinical picture manifest by the obsessive-compulsive individual in latency and beyond. Children usually manifest phobic reactions rather than classically obsessive-compulsive symptoms at the height of their Oedipal conflicts. This is true whether the child is destined eventually to become handicapped by severe compulsive mechanisms or by severe hysterical modes of reacting, or indeed whether he will largely overcome the effects of his infantile neurosis. Children first attempt to deal with the dangers engendered through their sexual and aggressive fantasies at the Oedipal period by the mechanisms of displacement, denial, and avoidance, which are not modes for control in the sense that I am using the term. The normal child will eventually master his conflicts in one way or another. The neurotic child will either largely continue to use mechanisms of denial and avoidance in dangerous situations, or begin largely, in the instance of the compulsive child, to bring to bear new modes of control for his imagined dangers. Various complex factors, some exerting their influence from the earliest years, some due to the events of the Oedipal period, influence whether the child will continue to deny or begin to use new methods of control in his instinctual urges. Some of these will be mentioned shortly. In large measure, the new modes for control at this time involve the active use of thought made possible by the more sophisticated state of his mental apparatus. Of course, the obsessive-compulsive individual will also use mechanisms of denial to deal with his dangers and will deploy other methods for control than the use of thought. However, the newly developed increased capacity for thinking as a means for dealing either realistically or neurotically with the world influences in a major way the form in which adaptive and defensive mechanisms are manifest in the Oedipal, post-Oedipal period. The capacity for thought and a significantly increased awareness of what it means to control and to be controlled are among the distinguishing features which contrast the controlling mechanisms during the Oedipal, post-Oedipal periods from the pre-Oedipal period. Undoubtedly, the more concretely a child has organized his pre-Oedipal world, and the more he has at that time been shut off from the healthier influences in milieu, the less he has been able to use his imaginative processes in an adaptive way, and then the more rigidly in the Oedipal period will he use thought as well as other compulsive measures, and the more megalomanic attitudes contaminate his sense of control at this later time. In essence, the theme will be the same at both periods, even if the chords are arranged more complexly at the later time. For example, a child who has dealt with what he feels to be his persecutors in the pre-Oedipal period by encasing himself in a narcissistic armor and by devaluating his attackers, will use thought in the Oedipal period to find reasons why his imagined enemies are impotent and worthless, and he will do this in an arrogant fashion. On the other hand, a child who has had more concern for his objects, who has been more influenced and identified with the healthier aspects of these objects, who has been less concrete in the way he has structured his pre-Oedipal world, who has been able to use his imagination in an adaptive fashion, will in the post-Oedipal period be more likely to use thought in a somewhat flexible fashion and to identify, at least to an extent, with his parents' ideas about control in a manner that potentially might lead to mastery of his difficulties rather than only serve to hold purported dangerous forces in check. He still may be more compulsive than hysterical. He might, for example, try to think about why someone close to him, toward whom he has ambivalent reactions, is upset, and account for this in a logical fashion and find logical ways to repair the damage. He uses thought processes rather than denial exclusively to deal with a danger, an indication of his compulsivity. His sense of control is associated with a concern for the object, and his thought processes may be realistic and adaptive, indications of relative health and integration. Yet he remains unaware of his sadism and is clearly vulnerable if either he or his loved objects become more angry at one another, indications of neurosis. A crucial question is suggested by these considerations. To what degree does parental behavior and attitudes during the Oedipal period influence the compulsivity of a child who is only moderately concrete and moderately controlled in his approach to the world up to that time? A parent who up to the Oedipal period has not been particularly frustrating or controlling, or who may indeed have encouraged the use of denial, may respond to his child's phobic reactions at that time by urging that the child face his displaced dangers, or indeed by confronting him with sexual knowledge and insisting that he think about matters that he cannot possibly assimilate. It is likely that under some circumstances, this behavior will increase the child's tendency to use compulsive mechanisms, in particular, to place a special value upon the deployment of thought to control dangers. Perhaps the question is better put this way. Are pre-Oedipal fixations, particularly anal fixations, essential for all phases of compulsivity? What are called compulsive mechanisms cover such a broad range of phenomena, the more integrated of which appear to me to be as much a reflection of maturational processes and or new types of interactions with parents as of an anal sadistic regression which has somehow activated old methods for control. Several people in this Congress have emphasized the concept of plurality of causes, and this cautions us against an oversimplified view of the etiology of all obsessive phenomena. I have already suggested that a child's capacity to respond appropriately to parental behavior that promotes his growth is a precondition for his ability to master his difficulties rather than just to control his dangers. Every child needs help in achieving structure. Various key people, unless his environment is totally chaotic, will attempt at certain periods of his life to help him to control his impulses, understand his reality, and even encourage him to master his fate, by which I mean foster the development of his own methods for dealing with the world around him. The more or less normal child, who has had more or less ordinary mothering, who has been helped in tolerating ambivalence, will not have so urgent a need for structure, and will not be so oppressed by urgent instinctual wishes that he misperceives what his environment might constructively offer him as a means for achieving satisfactory development and autonomy. The growth and structure promoting messages are delivered and received. Mental functioning develops in an integrated fashion. The compulsive child, on the other hand, beset by primitive urges, rage, passive wishes, guilt, unable to tolerate ambivalence, not only has a greater need for structure, but is more likely to distort whatever is presented to him as a means for achieving control. As already stated, the parents of compulsive children do, at some points, usually do try to promote appropriate awareness of reality and appropriate delay of impulses. They even at times want their child to develop his own ways of looking and dealing with the world. Of course, the fact that they are parents who have produced potentially compulsive children makes it less likely that these well-intentioned interests in their children will be as sustained and as free from frenzy as might be the case with better balanced parents. Their children's disruptive behavior and their own neurotic reactions will more often lead them to evoke edicts rather than to offer encouragement. Yet, whatever they have to give, which might otherwise be of value in the development of a child, is misread by the frantic child and as such internalized. Suggested measures for control are reacted to as implacable commands to be defied or submissively complied with. even manifests of the parents, or for that matter, the therapist's genuine desire for the child's growth are felt to be attacks, rejections, or seductions. The compulsive child, in comparison with his more normal counterpart, develops a harsh and controlling superego and rigid, ineffective modes for control, which in their most caricatured form take the shape of compulsive rituals. It should be stressed, however, that the compulsive suffers not only from symptoms, but from a lack, an inability to respond appropriate to those encounters with an interested people who want him to master rather than just defend himself against inner and outer danger. Leaving aside the existential overtones of this statement, it has, I feel, significant implications about the possibility for the successful treatment of the compulsive personality, a most complicated topic, the discussion of which I will defer.
My remarks will be quite of a general nature, and I think they include responses to Nagera's excellent review of the obsessive neuroses, something to do in relation to the theme of the Congress, and Dr. Valenstein has already touched on characterological aspects, and I think that Dr. Myerson, by stressing control, has selected one of the specific components for the development of character and in relation to the compulsion neurosis. As you all know, that Freud emphasized the compulsion neurosis so much in his studies, and I think this was primarily because the compulsion neurosis was the neurosis which dealt with conflict, which became internalized. Recently at the Hampstead Clinic, I attended a very interesting case presentation by Dr. Laufer, and as an introduction to this particular conference, Miss Freud asked the question about an adolescent who was very action-oriented. Why did this boy not internalize his conflicts? What interfered with the structuralization of his personality so that the conflict, instead of being internalized, was in relation to the external world? Now, I think the contrast between that type of adolescent and the type of individual we find in Frankie are worthwhile bearing in mind, because I think the antithesis and an important contrast between the compulsion neurosis is the impulsivity, or the problem of the impulsive aspects of the individual. I think Ms. Freud summarizes this problem very well in her book, and I quote, in which she states, "Accelerated ego development leads to an increase in conflicts, to neurotic symptom formation, and to the obsessive character. Accelerated drive development produces lack of control in matters of sex and aggression, insufficient integration of the personality, and impulsive personalities." I think this contrast, again, I want to emphasize, is very much worthwhile bearing in mind, because it raises questions, I think, that Dr. Valenstein hinted at when he spoke about the pre-stages of the compulsion neurosis. And in considering the pre-stages, again, historically, it's interesting that, for instance, Ferenczi, when he stressed the basis of the superego as being built on sphincter morality, all this was related to events that took place in the anal phase. And I think if we search for something analogous in the oral phase, I just don't know what that might be, but there must be something that may have a similar forestage to sphincter control, which is so important in the development of other general control. Now, I don't know how many of you heard my discussion this morning pertaining to Frankie. If you did, I'll spare you a repetition, but just to remind you in a few words what I did say, and that was that most of the discussants, when they talked about the compulsion neurosis as a defense organization, stressed the whole gamut of possibilities, from psychosis to borderline conditions, so psychosomatic conditions, depression, and so on. And I wanted to insert that the compulsion neurosis also is a defense primarily, I think, about the whole instinctual aspects of the personality. In other words, that the compulsion neurosis is a defense to impulse-ridden characters. I was very pleased, as you can imagine, when Dr. Ritvo came to me later and told me that this was Frankie, in essence, when he wasn't in control, he was an impulse-ridden character. And this led even Bertha Bornstein to the leading her to this period of intervention on the basis that this boy could get out of control. So I think you can see the contrast here too. Now, just as in the impulsive-ridden character, they have no conflicts about control. They just let themselves go. They're incontinent in every possible way. And I would here put the contrast again, that what the compulsive neurotic feels is the fear of loss of control. That when he develops any indication of an expression of impulse, his fear is that it can get away, in contrast to the impulsive individual who just lets himself go. And as I indicated about Frankie, that the kind of symptom he had was a retention of urine, in contrast to the psychopath or the impulsive character, who in his development shows a persistent enuresis. He already demonstrates that he has difficulties in developing sphincter morality, which foreshadows a later social immorality. The compulsive neurotic, along with the containment of affects, develops a capacity quickly to think in abstract terms. I will remind you that Ella Sharp, in one of her papers, in perhaps a speculative way, but interesting enough because I feel it has a certain confirmation of some of the ideas that I've presented, in which she said that the capacity to think in metaphors cannot develop until there is control of the sphincters. I don't know why she said it, but I think you can see how this fits in, again, with the compulsive neurotic, who develops in his thinking capacities from the concrete to the abstract. And here I would take some issue with Dr. Myerson, or perhaps it's a question of semantics, that in the cognitive style of his thinking, the compulsive neurotic develops in the direction of abstract, more spiritualistic, dissociative, an absence of feeling tone and less concreteness. Now, whether you meant concrete in some other form, I don't know, but I think if you study the cognitive styles in the writing and the thinking of the compulsive neurotics, you will find the abstract aspects highly developed. In contrast to the impulsive neurotic, in which there is a kind of fixation on a concrete orientation towards life. They think in terms of a somatic orientation. They're interested in things, grasping, holding, and things only have value to them. That's why they're interested in cars, in possessions, and so on. This may be related more to their fixation from an object standpoint, in their object relationships, that they're more fixated on the need-satisfying phase, so that they concretize and somatize the world and think in this way. This is borne out, for instance, when psychometric tests are given to these impulsive individuals. You find that they do very well on mechanical tests and very poorly on verbal tests, which is just the reverse of what you will find with the compulsive neurotics, whose abstract thinking and cognitive styles is in the direction of verbal facility and conceptualizations. Just to highlight the kind of character that goes with this impulsive character, am I taking too much time? That goes with the impulsive character, I'd just like to mention a cluster of traits that I think are often associated with them, again in contrast to the compulsive neurotic. These are action orientation, acting upon impulse, persistent enuresis, delayed language ability, reading disabilities, which are different than neurotic disabilities because they can't verbalize very well, and the difference in these in the performance tests that I mentioned. Another interesting question I would like to present to the group, and I think this is true, that from the standpoint of sex incidence, that there is a higher incidence of compulsion neurosis among males than in females, and we know that hysteria occurs much more in females. Now, whether this has to do with the underlying, first of all, that the fact that males are, I believe, innately more aggressive than females, and that in the compulsive neurotic, in order to deal with this, there has to be so much binding and holding and containment, leading into the passive development. Abraham mentioned that the melancholic in his normal period is a compulsive neurotic. And it was interesting that some individuals who studied these melancholics referred to them as being tightly sphinctered individuals in terms as a description of their type of personality that they had. Now, one final word, and that is the social value of the characterological aspects of the compulsive neurotic and his control elements. These are the individuals who make fine, respectable citizens. They assimilate the character structure very well into when the society is of a conforming, controlling nature. When they are in a social milieu of bureaucracies, in the army, organizations that in themselves have a kind of hierarchy of orderliness, in which the organization is run on orders, efficiency, and so on, a kind of compulsive neurotic organization. Dr. Valenstein and I and a social worker had occasion to study veterans who came back from the wars, and what we found was that those soldiers who became the best soldiers and endured the privations of war and the military organization were compulsive neurotics, those in their character structure, which blended with the social structure of the army. Now, Dr. Hartman has coined, I think, a very fine word for this, what he calls social compliance, the fit of a certain type of character with a certain kind of character structure. I'll only conclude with the fact that, as you all know too, that Freud elaborated very much upon the basis of civilization being based upon the taming of instincts, the renunciation of impulses, and I think he had in mind that this is where the compulsive neurotic comes in, and this is what civilization is based upon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michael. Yes, Ms. Freud. I must tell you something. Those of you who have got the monograph, since we put it in this form and distributed it for discussion, a number of papers that we were not aware of have come to light, and some of them have been included in the one I have here with me now, but luckily I had not the time to circulate it amongst the members of this meeting. In the future, I have a very long list of people who have received the monograph, and I promise that I will send to you those papers that we have since make a summary of and intend to include in the monograph. Incidentally, I'll be very grateful to those that have contributed papers in the subject of obsession and neurosis at the Congress if I could have a copy, because we would like to include a number of them in a summarized form so as to bring it up to date. Otherwise, we have produced something that, because of the Congress, is already out of date to a certain extent. I call now Ms. Freud. Yes, Ms. Freud, so you are recorded, and we'll keep it for posterity, yeah?
I really only have a few questions to insert into the present discussion. And besides, I want to quarrel with two words that have been used in the morning and also here. One of these is the word concrete for the thinking of the obsessional, in the sense in which Dr. Michaels queried it now. It seemed to me that this word was used not in the way it's not in the right way, but to imply what we would call abstract thinking divorced from emotion. Because what the compulsive child or adult tries to bring about is a train of thought from which emotion is excluded altogether. It's the absence of affect and not the concreteness. And that is why the ideal of such a highly obsessional individual is the computer, who can think without feeling. And I suppose all of you have had patients who had this computer ideal. I had one where this played a great part, and he tried to train his mind to function as a computer, and tried in all sorts of ways to really castigate his body and torture his body so as to exclude the body from the mind. This division of mind and body, or rather of emotion and thought content, seemed to him the highest ideal, which is of course a form of isolation, but it goes much further than the usual mechanism of isolation. The other word is the word control. And the people from the clinic know that I have always some quarrel with that word, because it's very widely used now, but it seems to me on the point where it's beginning to swallow up defense. And since I'm very partial to the concept of defense, I would like to save it from that fate. When we use the term defense, I believe, we are quite clear what we mean. We mean the warding off of id content, impulse or affect by the ego. When we call this control, we leave it open whether we in the concept we also include an attitude towards the external world and towards the objects. It is so, control is so often used in the sense that the child tries to control the parents, let us say. But when we use the same term for the attempt to dominate the objects and for the attempt to keep id content from entering the ego, I think we create confusion rather than clarifying matters. And I would like to ask Dr. Myerson why he prefers the wider and less clear concept of control to that of defense. I'm sure there is a reason for it. And the third question I wanted to ask really Dr. Valenstein is why in the discussion, I read the notes of the discussion too, why in the discussion so far as compulsive manifestations in childhood is concerned, why you excluded the transitory aspect of these phenomena? It seems to me that this is an attitude very easily taken by analysts of adults when they turn to the study of childhood, and especially if they do so by the first of the methods you mentioned, namely by applying the theoretical concepts as we have them already. It seems to me that whereas these phenomena are fairly stable where we meet them in adults, as you say, once an obsessional, he will never be a hysteric, that this does not apply in the same way to children, where in one phase, and you find that in Dr. Nagera's description very clearly, where in one phase you get a profusion almost of obsessional styles, as you call it now, of obsessional modes of warding off content, and to your surprise you get simultaneously or a little later or a little earlier hysterical ones or others, or real somatization. There is a fluidity of these reactions in childhood, which I think we should not neglect and overlook, because it's one of the main contrasts between all these pathological, also the normal as well as the pathological manifestations in children and in adults.
Thank you very much, Ms. Freud. Perhaps we will answer these questions if you like, Dr. Myerson. And
I made several indications that the semantic problems would contaminate the discussion that they obviously had. And to take up the matter of concreteness, really what I was making a plea for was or trying to indicate that there was a change in concreteness depending upon the time at which the compulsive mechanisms, the so-called compulsive mechanisms, became manifest. That is, a child who at a very early age was overwhelmed with instinctual tension, who perhaps is an impulsive child in many respects, but still who has compulsive controls of the more primitive sort that have been described, has a great deal of concreteness in his thinking, and that the more integrated compulsive child, the child where the compulsivity becomes more manifest in the Oedipal period, the child who has had a quite vivid fantasy life, and who perhaps, like Hans, had a very vivid capacity for imagination, developed a phobia, and subsequently developed a compulsive mechanism. So I'm hypothesizing that Hans would become more compulsive after this experience, would not be so concrete, that he, if he were a compulsive, that he would use his intellect only as we see compulsivity used, not in a concrete fashion. And what I feel is needed is a careful study of the phenomena of concreteness as it develops, as it is manifest, depending upon the various stages in which compulsive mechanisms are instituted. Secondly, I believe, though, that there's a difference between concreteness or abstract behavior in the general area of intellect. That is, the compulsive may be have very great capacity for abstraction, but in the emotionally charged areas of his life, that is, when the stress is on, that I think you'll find that he can easily regress to a kind of concrete way of thinking in the special area of his conflict. That is, if he gets very angry, or he has some kind of anal regression, that when he deals with his object, he thinks about his objects much more concretely than he does in the non-conflictual areas of his life. So that I certainly don't hold any brief for the term concrete. It leaves me a little uneasy, but it is a class of phenomena, especially of the
Could you give us an example of concrete thinking of your
of
what would you call concrete thinking? What you were just, could you give an example for what you just named?
Well, let me see if I can give some material from the paper that I gave in December. I described an instance of a man who had a relationship with his wife in which he, generally speaking, at least in the early stages of his marriage and in the early stages of analysis, tended to use a great deal of denial. If she were angry, he didn't recognize it, and he had fantasies that everything was all right, or if she were angry at him, he'd find another woman. Then, as he became more aware that she was angry at him, he began to no longer used so much denial, but began to think about why she was angry. And he would say, well, she must be angry because the children are upsetting her. He'd find some rationalization, but he'd start to think about it. He'd use mental processes. This still is not what I'd call concreteness. Then, in a situation where this last instance had happened, his wife was angry, he didn't deny it, he began to think about it, account for it, but he still continued to be angry at her and had a very sadistic sexual relationship with her. The next day, he began to, he had an obsessive thought, namely that he had to make sure that he hadn't left the key on his wife's ignition turned on. And he had to make sure that he turned it off. That is, he had a compulsive ritual in which he dealt in a displaced way, in a very, I think, semi-concrete way with certain feelings that he was having. I don't know if this is the best example. I'm trying to give you an example from somebody who is not a borderline person, but somebody who under stress regresses to a kind of thinking which is, while contaminated with primary process thinking, who at the same time feels a need to who cannot go back to using denial. He has to deal with the environment and certain dangers which he feels a damage that he's inflicted on the environment by a kind of concreteness. Okay.
I think I was right to distrust the world.
Yeah. Well, we use a really concrete and abstract in a very different meaning, in a very different context. Perhaps we could give later some examples of the way in which we use it. For example, we have many examples, for example, from the blind, and so on, as to abstract thinking and concrete thinking and so on. And we can come back to it, but before we get involved in a discussion in this field, I have still somebody who has prepared a statement for this evening, and I would like to call on Dr. Weissman. We will listen to his comments, and then perhaps we come back to these points. I don't know if Dr. Valenstein or Dr. Macker will want to add something in relation to Ms. Freud's comments. If you do, just after Dr. Weissman, we come back to it, yes? Please do come in, Dr. Weissman.
My prepared comments will be restricted to comments on Dr. Nagera's monograph in the main, and if any other ideas occur to me that have grown in the process of being at the Congress that I can alertly talk about, I'll try to. In the preface to his monograph, Dr. Nagera reminds us that Freud noted that the study of obsessional neurosis is rewarding if not mastered. Dr. Nagera's study is one of the best examples of such a reward. Those of us who have pondered the relationship between pre-Oedipal and post-Oedipal obsessional neurosis can be grateful to him for his thorough investigation of this subject. He has clinically demonstrated that the cases he studied of post-Oedipal obsessional neurosis, beginning in latency and pre-puberty, showed no scars of pre-Oedipal, that is true pre-Oedipal obsessional neurosis. He has clearly demonstrated that the so-called pre-Oedipal obsessional neurosis is often associated with defects in the ego and retarded development. Further, he gives evidence that pre-Oedipal symptoms in his cases are only quasi-obsessional and therefore are not the precursors of the post-Oedipal obsessional symptom. Dr. Nagera promises us a fuller account in a forthcoming publication on the subject of these pre-Oedipal phenomena in terms of developmental interference and conflicts as well as neurotic conflicts. It would be clarifying if Dr. Nagera could now elaborate for us at this meeting the structural nature of the pre-Oedipal obsessional disturbance due to neurotic conflict and disclose how these pre-Oedipal obsessional neurotic conflicts differ from those of post-Oedipal origin. It was unfortunate that Dr. Nagera's investigations of the relationship between obsessional character and obsessional neuroses was not undertaken from a developmental viewpoint after his study on a developmental approach to obsessional neurosis and his subsequent developmental approach in his study of some general and diagnostic considerations in obsessional neurosis. As it stands, his views are unnecessarily confined to an economic elaboration of the alteration in the status of the instinctual drives and defenses in the reversible transformation of an obsessional neurosis into an obsessional character. It seems to me that these views do not encompass the full range of structural and developmental interrelationships that exist between obsessional neurosis and obsessional character. Dr. Nagera states that the sublimation of the anal drives leads to a normal obsessional character, whereas the obsessional neurosis represents an ongoing anxiety-producing conflict between the internal forces of anal drives and ego defenses. He accounts for the obsessional character disorder as a non-anxiety provoking state of affairs in which the personality is obsessionally exaggerated, which is mostly disturbing to the environment and somewhat disturbing to one's own ego performance. My discontent with these formulations is that Dr. Nagera has neglected to consider the equal importance of the status of precocious ego development in obsessional character and character disorder as he does in obsessional neurosis. Not the existence of it, but the problem of it. Dr. Nagera later on does acknowledge that in obsessional neurosis, the archaic superego or the rigid sadistic superego is derived from precocious ego development. In light of such considerations, we must ask ourselves a number of questions. What is the status of superego development in the obsessional character disorder, and the obsessional neurosis? Is it a different type of superego in each category, or is the superego the same in all? It would be difficult to imagine that an obsessional character, which is considered a variation of normal development, has a severe sadistic, or if you will, archaic superego, by which his instinctual drives are mainly governed. It is equally difficult to conceive a severe obsessional neurotic whose anal drives are regulated by a so-called mature genital superego. Put simply, the obsessional neurotic is dominated by an archaic superego which commands ritualistic and compulsive acts as well as obsessional thinking. The absence of such symptoms in obsessional character implies the absence of an archaic superego and the presence of a more mature one. In my own study, I have suggested that in every individual, the superego consists of both mature and archaic components. I have further contended that the archaic superego components have a relative supremacy over the mature superego components in obsessional neurosis. The obsessional character, on the other hand, appears to be the result of the predominating influence of the mature superego components. Clinically viewed, then, the obsessional character and the obsessional neuroses usually coexist in a given individual, but seem to vary in each case, with more symptom formation in one and more character formation in another. The ratio of symptom and character may vary in the lifespan of a given individual. It is questionable whether the change from obsessional character formation to symptom formation and vice versa in any individual is a reversible two-way passage, as has been suggested, and depends only on conditions which increase or decrease the drives and defensive activities, resulting in increased or decreased anxiety respectively. Obsessional character and obsessional neurosis very frequently are interchangeable with phobias and depressions, as we have heard in the predominating clinical case that was presented at this Congress. When there is a transformation of an obsessional character into an obsessional neurosis, such a change involves not only an ego regression, but a significant regression of the superego to its more archaic components. Primitive commands can now be dictated in the manner that is customarily seen in obsessional neurosis. These considerations are offered as supplements to Dr. Nagera's formulations on the interrelationship between obsessional neurosis and character. They emphasize the same developmental approach so admirably applied by him in his later considerations of the interrelationship between the so-called pre-Oedipal and post-Oedipal neurosis. I wish to congratulate Dr. Nagera, whose comprehensive monograph I found to be highly rewarding and illuminating to study.
Thank you very much. Dr. Valenstein?
Actually, before I really gave only the first, really an introduction as to the general outlines of the panel, I think Miss Freud put his point is really the nub of the matter, which is what we thought we might riddle about, namely, whether there is something, so to speak, from the beginning, more or less so, to be discerned, which has continuity, despite the fact that there is a relative fluidity for the child as compared to the adult in his style of adaptive response. I mean that he can change, that he has potential, most children, for a considerable imaginative and fantasy possibility, that he's phobic, that he can be obsessional, but nonetheless, whether children from the beginning can be discerned to have a preference, so to speak, an innate predilection with regard to mastering the ordinary exigencies of the external world. And whether this, for example, the question was raised, whether this styling, insofar as it might intersect with a premature trauma or stress, might then set the stage for the form of the infantile neurosis. It really is the issue of whether we can say more about the matter of specificity of neurosis than perhaps the somewhat insufficient theories that we have on hand so far, namely to focus very much on stages of development in terms of trauma at the anal phase, trauma which hardly comes at that point, but comes at the phallic and genital stage. And I, for one, was led into it by watching a small child and watching what seemed to me an enthusiasm for mastery through systematization of response in terms of learning to understand and to cope with things in a very, I would say, in a very concrete and in a very, I shouldn't use that word, it's a very dangerous word to use tonight. Very concrete. I always say, it always reminds me of a story. If a patient says, I feel this and I feel that, and I had the feeling the patient's far too abstract, I said, I'm not sure what you mean. I thought one feels with one's hands. And perhaps you could tell me what you mean, how you feel. Meaning I want them to get down to the use of the hands, into something which is concrete and bodily and very three-dimensional and very affect-laden and very perceptual. And then I begin to think we're getting down to the concrete, if we can get it in these regards. But in any case, the issue was that I had a chance to watch a child from the beginning in his predilections to experiment with his apparatuses, with his voice, then with his limbs, then with walking. And at 14 months, with a tendency to reinstate the order of things, tripping up a piece of the rug, going back and replacing it, before one could have very good evidence that there was an anal problem. Yes, well, I'll go on a little bit further. That this continued. This matter of, it's a matter of mastery, it's a matter of coping. The speculative theory, it is a speculative theory. It's based upon perhaps a false retrospection or extrapolation from adult observation that a child might have this mode, and if they run into trouble, that this intensifies, that every child, that the very notion of autonomous ego presupposes a systematization of response, that some children may systematize, so to speak, that much more and that much more aptly, that this might be forced under exigent circumstances and become really the Anlage of a later obsessionalism in clinical terms. It needn't go that far, but that this tendency to systematize, to master in bodily terms, may presage the same trend in intellectual terms at a later point, within the range of normal. But nonetheless, that this state of affairs may be the very nexus out of which obsessionalism could develop as one pole apart from the notion of conflict. That doesn't mean that it's mutually inconsistent with conflict and the problem of the battle of the bathroom at the stage of anality. But it simply means that a child disposed in this direction, running into unhappy circumstances, might become obsessional. On the other hand, he might not, and simply develop that kind of strength of character, that durability, which we value in a reasonable degree of compulsivity. This was the question that was raised. We didn't know that we could answer it. It obviously depends upon very careful, systematic study of children from the very beginning, as such a thing as Gifford is doing when he studies newborns, maybe as best he can, considering their ways and how they might differ, and to see what's their later fate and trying to understand it vis-a-vis the circumstances that they run into in family life and in terms of conflict. I don't know that it's an issue that it's fluidity versus a rigid adherence to a constitutional mode. I don't think it's either or. The question is whether there is a relativistic predilection for children, nonetheless that there is a considerable potential for fluidity as compared to adults. And this was the question we brought up. I don't know that we had the answer. I think it's not only the Hampstead Clinic, but extraordinarily enlightened nursery settings that might give us, where you could, and the Hampstead Clinic has it, where you can study from the beginning very carefully children that we had in mind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valenstein. Before I give an opportunity to Mrs. Balkanyi, I would like to try some of the answers, to answer some of the questions of Dr. Weissman. I'm afraid not all of them. I don't know the answer of the large majority of those that he posed. But perhaps I better answer The ones that refer to the question of not having presented the character neurosis developmentally as we attempted to do with obsessional neurosis, with the development of the obsessional neurosis. And the answer is very simple. It's, perhaps the best way for me to answer it is to tell you the procedure by means of which we have arrived at this conclusion. And it is largely based on observation. And I am afraid that we we have not yet collected, though we have quite a few, observations as to at what point in the development of the child are certain character traits of what we call an anal character, later an obsessional character, already taken into the personality structure. Now we have some observations, and those of the members here in the audience from the group will remember that I frequently point out in the group that this child already when he is 2, yes, has solved a particular conflict with some of his anal impulses, for example, by taking into the character structure in the form of a reaction formation where, of course, sadism has been dealt with by pity or something or similar. And we have, of course, very many such examples. I am afraid not quite enough. What Dr. Valenstein said is very true. We have an educational unit where we have largely normal children, and we observe them very, very careful for this purpose. We draw from this material because it is at this particular stage that we want to have the opportunity to see how early it can happen that some people develop a specific character structure, while some people will not do so until much later on. Why that is so in some cases and not in others is something for which I have no answer whatsoever. We do know that in some children it happens very early. In some children, of course, and it's a part solution of the problem. Some of the conflicts are solved in this way by taking into the character structure, sometimes very, very early on, as I said, during the anal phase itself, yeah? In some other children, I couldn't say why. It obviously depends on some characteristic, a quality of the ego, that there is such a difference. In some of them, the situation remains much more fluid, and there is an ongoing conflict. Perhaps it's not a very productive one in terms of symptom formation, but one that you can see from time to time, sort of comes and goes. The child develops a few symptoms and they go away again and so on, and it remains like that sometimes for very many years. It's only until latency, or sometimes even later than latency, that they finally solve some such conflicts, but by means of taking into the personality in forms of character trait, certain specific tendencies that tend to avoid the situation of conflict. We have a few observations as well, but as I said, not really enough that we will feel certain that we could formulate anything very much out of it. We are just trying to collect them. But we do have some observation, for example, that this can take place as late adolescence. We have a few observations as well, but as I said, not really enough that we will feel certain that we could formulate anything very much out of it. We are just trying to collect them. But we do have some observation, for example, that this can take place as late adolescence. I mean, it's certainly not unusual, or so it seems to me, on the basis of what we have observed, that very many people keep a fluid situation of conflict with certain aspects, certain component instincts, let's say, certain aspects of the personality remain very conflicted for a long time. Some may have been solved earlier, but certain aspects remain in this fluid state for a very long time. And in late adolescence, some neurotic conflicts are solved by taking into the character structure a certain attitude that will avoid the conflict. And so let's say some adolescent with active passive conflict, strong bisexual conflicts and so on, a great deal of castration anxiety, may decide to become passive generally, or to avoid a competition for women with people of his age and so on. And in this way, by a sort of avoidance, a general tendency to avoid the situation of competition, they have solved a conflict. They no longer produce symptoms, the anxiety disappears and so on. Of course, they do so at the expense of having restricted the ego in certain respects, for example. Now, we have many observations, but they are not enough. For some reason, perhaps we haven't paid as much attention to this aspect, or didn't learn to look at the relevant clinical material early enough to have now sufficient material to produce an answer, but we hope that in due time we will. If I can answer another of your questions, this relates to the question of the pre-Oedipal and post-Oedipal neurosis. This is a term I will not use. I don't believe in the pre-Oedipal neurosis, yes? I know that there are many forms of disturbances, of conflict situations that are neurotic in character, and that they produce symptoms, and that superficially they are, of course, very similar to what we see later on. But to me, as it was to Freud, I believe this is a very important concept, and it's a very well-founded one. It's not really, it tends to confuse many important issues to extend this concept to such a degree. I think we do well in trying to define the different conflicts at the different developmental stages, and they are not the same, because if only because, of course, the structures involved in the conflict are not quite developed to the same degree, and I mean the interaction between them is a very different one. So I keep the term infantile neurosis to the specific conflicts when the child reaches the phallic Oedipal phase. And phallic Oedipal means here not only in terms of the drive development, but in terms of the development that by that time, when the drive has got as far as that, the degree of development that the ego has been able to reach as well. I mean, in terms of object relationships, on the other hand, as well. I think that the infantile neurosis, and this I describe in a monograph, which I think I have sent to you if you have an opportunity, is an attempt at solving a very large number of problems at this particular stage. Now, what happens before, of course, if we are not going to call it a neurosis, we must create a name for it. And this I tried to do. I mean, I didn't invent them. Really, they were more or less available in psychoanalysis for a long time. So, for example, what we observe during the anal phase, which is very similar superficially to obsessional manifestations, and that is why I call it quasi-obsessional, are really developmental conflicts of a certain type. The proof that they are not properly established obsessional neuroses at that particular stage is that very many of them are transitory, and they will go just with development. And of course, once you have a proper infantile neurosis, one which is properly rooted, this is not a frequent happening anymore without some kind of therapeutic intervention. Many of these early conflicts, of course, are of a different nature. They may be already neurotic conflicts where structures are involved and where there is no possibility of solution, of settlement at that particular stage. But I do believe that many of them are left waiting for a better opportunity, and the better opportunity for the ego, when there is a powerful tendency in the ego when he reaches a certain degree of development to sensitize development, so to say, at a particular stage, and to produce a very economic solution of the conflict of this very important point in the development of the child in the phallic Oedipal phase with all the previous situation of conflict. I think it's a formidable task to try and unify all this development, all this conflictive situation into the one illness. And of course, that's why I say I think we ought to keep apart. I shouldn't personally don't like to use pre-Oedipal infantile neurosis. It doesn't make much sense to me in this respect.
Can I ask a question? You say that apparently an obsessional neurosis goes, so to speak, with development. What is the character, style, or form with which the child is met?
It's not an obsessional neurosis. What I mean is that
quality, you would characterize it.
For example, you refer to the educational unit, and we frequently observe there some of the children that when they go through this particular phase, the anal phase, they will produce symptoms which very much resemble the symptoms that will appear in a properly established obsessional neurosis. The difference is that if you wait, in very many of these cases, they disappear, and we follow some of them through many years, and they never later on develop into an obsessional neurosis. Now, we have started to wonder what happens.
What kind of a character?
Yeah. What happens to them? Well, all sorts of things happen. Please don't take me wrong. I wish I knew the answers to all these questions, but we have a few observations, and we are collecting them. In some of them, this proved to be a massive conflict, let's say, of a very precocious ego, perhaps in a certain setting, in a given environment, which shows a very diminished, an intolerant attitude to certain forms of expression of aggression and anal matters and so on, which this precocious ego of the child will immediately catch, and because of its own precocity, of course, will be much more forced to comply with certain demands. He's much more aware of it. Now, that sort of an ego will react, I think, in the observation we have made, I have no other explanation myself, this is the way I have tried to put it to myself, will react quite quickly and strongly against whatever anal drive is present, and that need not be very much. It just is that he is extremely intolerant to whatever there is to be observed. Now, obviously, as soon as development takes the next step and the libido moves out of that phase, from the next step, that conflict has disappeared. If you say, what has happened to it? I think this is one of such conflicts where development has solved the situation. It will play a very minor role in the character development, in the structure of the personality later on. It's a true developmental conflict in that sense. Of course, this need not always be the case. Sometimes they leave behind certain marks, or they require forms of solution that will be in the form of character, development of an obsessional type, yes? So-called anal character. But there are all sorts of possibilities, only that we are just at the stage of collecting these observations.
You see, it reminds me of a research which I've been involved in for some years, where we studied the pregnant women, and we had to categorize. We had to delineate how we understood the lifestyle or the character style of these women. Not necessarily that they had to be clinically neurotic this way or that way. We considered some to be style, more, as we said, along obsessive lines. We got into the problem, of course, is that to use such words generally signifies a neurotic trend, which we didn't have in mind. When we meant that their pattern of defenses, responses, leaned more in that direction. They were more systematic, they were more thoughtful, they were more planful, they were more masterful, and so forth, where some other women were far more given to artistic, imaginative, and were somewhat sloppy and this and that, all within, let's say, a nice normal range. And this is the issue we have.
Ms. Frank?
If I can answer, I couldn't agree more with what Dr. Valenstein says, so far as adults are concerned. But the surprising phenomenon with children is that through development, the impulses or the component instincts which arouse conflict change, and the cognitive mode over the ego defenses change with it, which of course would confirm the idea of the tie between certain forms of defense and certain forms of danger. Well, this would not be the case if the individual is already committed to this particular defense, in the sense you said it before. Some individual children can be very early committed to selected defenses and neglect the others. But others who haven't made the same strict commitment change their mode of defense with the danger. And we see it after all in the change from pre-adolescence to adolescence once more, where there is a similar fluidity with a different instinctual content coming to the fore. What has gone before is suddenly gone, and you ask, where is it? But if for some reason the same instinctual danger turns up again, the child would again revert to the same mode of defense, which is, this is certainly what one can see in observation, on the one hand, of course, in the analysis of children, but in the longitudinal observation of children. And if I can go on, if I can go back once more to your toddler observation, I I think what you have observed there in this child is a particular stage of intellectual, of thought development, which Hartmann has characterized very well and characterized as distinct from the anal. From the anal drive altogether. There's nothing to do with it. The child is not yet anal, the child has not yet entered toilet training or anything of the kind. But at least that's what Hartmann says. Usually, in normal development, or what we expect to happen in expectable development, these two things coincide. The child doesn't arrive at this type of mastery of his inner thought world before he has arrived also at the inner problems. Well, the inner problems depend very much on the environmental circumstances. And then in certain children, and especially those where ego development is very good and very forward, you get these types of mastery and orderliness long before the anal phase.
That's what was so fascinating.
Yes.
Because then when the anal phase came along, it over-pushed it to a I wouldn't say to an inappropriate degree, but to a somewhat wearing degree for sometimes the child and even the family. But it happened that this kind of mastery proceeded, and then came the anal phase in which it doubly determined it and gave it a further thrust. Then is the speculation. Where the anal phase met unwisely within the family, one may get a very good nexus for really neurotic obsessionals. But there was this issue of the first mastery.
Well, but this is, I think, something all children go through at one time or another. Only as with all these developmental trends, not all children do the same in the same intensity. Some more and some less. And your question would really be whether these quantitative differences, which are also chronological differences, a little earlier, a little later, whether they lead a little later to the commitment to one or the other character style, which then remains.
That's the question.
And that is the question, and that can only be solved really by very extensive observation. You know, I had a question of a similar kind, which goes a little beyond the framework of the obsessional neuroses. I called it general characteristics. Are there characteristics in children from the beginning which enter later and are used of in character formation? And I looked for them in the area of, well, frustration tolerance. We know that there is an enormous difference. How children can wait already in the earliest stages before really control and mastery is established. The same, I believe, is there in the attitude towards anxiety. How much can they take? And those who can take less are much more endangered neurotically because they have to use defense in an exaggerated way. And I think the same is even true in the tendency to progress or regress. But we don't know yet, and we are trying very hard to find out, is that there from the beginning, or is it produced through the handling in the first year of life? And then at what time is it made use of by one or the other complex mechanism that leads into neuroses? And I think in all these elements there that Dr. Nagera has described for the obsessional neuroses, this is really the way it begins. They are there normally. They are there as transitional phenomena, accompanying phase development. But there's a little more or a little less. They come earlier, they come later. They come together with different bits of drive development. And then we get the mixture. And then we have to unravel the mixture. but it's not as it looks when you look at the adult.
We have abused Mrs. Balkanyi patients. Could you come now? Would you like to please? There is no limit to this meeting as far as I am concerned. I like talking. I am prepared to go for a very long time. But perhaps you ought to fix the time, if you prefer, I mean.
But I will talk much.
Yes?
Anyhow, I was very grateful, and I will be even more grateful to Dr. Valenstein if he had to send his observations about these precursors of obsessional style or obsessional neurosis. What I wanted to ask is whether one could think that way, that some trouble is in, or might get into our thinking when, or to avoid the trouble in our thinking, to take the repetition compulsion under the rule of which these happenings you just mentioned with the learning and mastery of the small child could be explained, and then to think that, of course, in the obsessional neurosis, the repetition compulsion has a major part, but it need not to be the other way around, that when the child is in the in that first phase or so, functioning often under the rule of the repetition compulsion, that this would be something obsessional. Well, something to be seen about that, but just to take the repetition compulsion here as a guiding principle in sorting out these matters. But of course, why should the obsessional neurosis have no precursor? Everything has a precursor, but this is what I just thought. Now, the other thought about concreteness, I was most grateful that Miss Freud brought that up, because we hear it so often in all its connections misused, because these days the schizophrenic thinking is also called very often, at least in London, concrete thinking, whereas it isn't. As it stands in the unconscious, sie behandeln konkrete Dinge, als ob sie abstrakte wären, which means the opposite. But with the obsessional, I wonder whether Mr. Myerson or Dr. Myerson hadn't had that sort of obsessional thinking in mind. What happens, for instance, with the Ratman, which is rather a wrong generalization, which is very typical of the obsessional thinking. When for instance, when he dreads and is horrified of the thought of marriage and the whole item, and this derives all from the word, again the German word, heiraten, the rats, an allusion at the rats. In due course, heiraten, to marry, is impossible. So it is this is the typically obsessional verbalization, and that is rather a wrong generalization, I would suggest. But, of course, there is also the lack of abstract thinking, or something wrong there. What I think and thought throughout these beautiful papers about Frankie and the Ratman, whether one couldn't say that coincidence, temporal coincidence in the instinctual development and in ego development around the anal phase would be typified by the development of the verbal function, which happens to be very, very much in its beginning when the anal phase is on. So that when the regression happens in obsessional neurosis, where that obsessional person falls back in verbal development, is that toddler age when verbalization could not carry out its main function, which, at least as far as I can see, is the binding of energy, by attaching the correct meaning to the thing. That is how the binding of energy happens. This is the function of verbalization, and this is disturbed in the obsessional neurotic. Now, when Dr. Hoffer pointed it out this morning, the brooding of Frankie, that it is a seeming ease with which he thinks, but that thinking doesn't bind the energy. He goes on and on. It is, as Dr. Hoffer said, he isn't here, as he has said then, that he doesn't believe that obsessional thinking would have been simply a displacement from obsessions, and I neither think that it would be that way, but a kind of restitution symptom, an attempt to use now thinking instead of the matter, and so on.
Thank you very much. Balkanyi. Dr. Schur, I think you want to say something.
Well, as I've written to you, I did not prepare any formal discussion, but I heard so much today, and I read your beautiful summary. Let me just say some random remarks. Dr. Valenstein started with the problem of constitution. He brought first, he mentioned the question of the strength of the instincts, and then came back to the difference in the ego Anlage. Now, Freud, of course, referred to the constitutional aspects, specifically as referring to obsessional neurosis in many of his papers. As far as the strength of the instincts, there is one beautiful letter to Marie Bonaparte published by Jones, where he declares that the question of psychosis is actually a question of the quantity of instincts. As long as we cannot know and do not know enough about the quantity of instincts and about the mixture between aggressive and libidinous energy, we cannot say anything definite about the about this problem. However, Freud also always, when he deals with conflict and he deals with the problem of danger and the question of a traumatic situation, there's always a question of a relation of forces. Now, of course, when we are dealing with early developmental factors, it is not the question only what kind of ego is it and what kind of drive is it, but at what phase, what kind of ego under what environmental phases meet each other to create this type of a conflict. Now, the fact of a certain precociousness of the ego in obsessional neurosis has been observed by many people, and I must say whoever examines, whoever has experience in reconstruction of analysis has a very high incidence, and statistics are very difficult for analysts, of a certain precociousness. Now, of course, if the ego develops very early, now whether it is a precocity in the motoric development, a precocity in the perceptual development, or a precocity in perception of environmental reactions, such a child is exposed, of course, in a completely different to the drives, even if the drive components are actually normal. And this is what we encounter in many situations. Now, what Dr. Valenstein describes is a child which is endowed. Now, that endowed, and Piaget, for instance, has described also beautifully, purely phenomenologically, how such qualities as he described develop in various times. You are certainly familiar with the fact that the new and probably quite dangerous experiment of mathematicians show that children between 2 and 3 are capable of conceptualizing quite complex mathematical and physical concepts far beyond the capacity of what we have learned in high school or even in college. Now, of course, a child with a certain endowment will be more capable to integrate such things. Now, what develops then later on depends again, and here it becomes extremely difficult, because any variable in the environment already can tip the scale one way or the other. And to unravel this in one observation, or 2 or 3 or 10 observations, is probably extremely difficult. Only observation is done in such places as you or at Yale or whatnot, where we are dealing with hundreds of observations over a series of many, many years in terms of the developmental line, can then give us perhaps an answer. Now, for instance, the question of excessive stimulation. Now, of course, excessive stimulation depends again on the responding organization. Now, something which is even not perceived by a certain child is an excessive stimulation in another child. Now, we know, for instance, and this was one of the last study which the late Dr. Benjamin entertained, is that parallel with the development of what one called wrongly the cathexis, and actually it is a maturation of the perceptual apparatus, at the age between 6 weeks and 12 weeks, there is and this is paralleled by a certain change in the electroencephalon pattern and a certain beginning of the dream pattern different from the one in the newborn. There is a heightened irritability of the child, and he described it as one of the first critical phases from a purely developmental aspect. Now, of course, a child with a premature ego development, with a premature development of the perceptual apparatus, will be excessively stimulated by stimuli which basically are not excessive as far as an average expectable environment in Hartmann's sense is controlled. I'm going just to my notes. The question of concreteness. I was one of the guilty ones who this morning mentioned the term concreteness. Now, what I had in mind is the following, that and here we cannot speak about the obsessive compulsive thinking, but I think Dr. Myerson brought it up later on. The obsessive compulsive person has many areas in which he thinks completely normally, and there's no doubt about it that, let's say, a scientist with obsessive compulsive neuroses is capable of the highest level of abstraction and highest level of abstract thinking. However, we all know, and this has been stressed today repeatedly, and this is what I have in mind, is that an obsessive compulsive tend to libidinization of their thought content and of their thought processes. Now, this is something which Dr. which Freud has exemplified so beautifully in the rat man. Now, if, for instance, now this obsessive compulsive, I take clinical examples where we get our best examples from training analysis. Let's take a training, a candidate who has high level of abstraction, but who has a strong tendency to libidinize his thought processes. Now, the example which I brought this morning is that to touch upon a certain topic, even without using the word touching on a topic, can be completely equated with masturbation. Now, this is something which I call concrete thinking. Another example on the other side of the coin, in the terms of anxieties or dangers, is the same candidate, for instance, comes to a session well prepared, and the instructor starts to introduce the session, and he had the assignment to report about it. Now, the instructor started to develop certain thoughts which he had well prepared and was very proud that he will bring them up. Now, first of all, the mere fact of the instructor bringing it up is being treated completely concretely as first as a delay in the oral sense, and then it is when this goes on and he really cannot bring this up anymore, he deals with this taking away of this thought directly as if it were castration. Now, with other words, we can call it that the obsessive compulsive can treat the thought process as if they were part of his soma. He resomatizes the thought process and thought contents, and this is a concretization. Would you agree with that? All right. Now, it's a question of transitory phenomena in the pre-edible phases. My experiences are, of course, limited. Besides observation of a few children and grandchildren, are limited to reconstruction. Now, Freud, of course, has described it and emphasized so beautifully that the infantile phobias are actually omnipresent and they somehow disappear. They just go here. And it is, of course, extremely important not to call them phobias, but they are the normal anxieties, which can be exaggerated anxieties or can be normal anxieties. They can fall under the category which Ms. Freud mentioned before, that we can observe at this phase already children who have a lower tolerance for danger and mastering danger, and a greater ability to master danger, a lower tolerance for separation, let's say a greater tolerance for separation, what Grüniger calls predisposition to develop later abnormal anxiety. However, in the phobias of adults, one gets really the impression that this starts very early. Very early in life, they have these exaggerated responses. Now, when we go back to the Frankie case and to many other cases, one somehow gets the impression, and of course in longitudinal observation, you have much more occasion to observe this, that something in such cases which develop, let's say, relatively early, well circumscribed phobia, say at the age of 4 or 5, something probably already has gone wrong at a very early phase. In other words, that they enter the second year already with some exaggerated responses to the normal frustration, or to the normal separation, or to the normal delay, or to what Winnicott would call the poor holding by the mother, etc. At least that's how it looks in the reconstruction of analysis. Whether it holds true for childhood development is extremely difficult to say. And probably the same applies also to obsessive compulsive neuroses. Now, something which came up this morning and which you mentioned in your monograph, there is, of course, the same way as Freud says there is anxiety hidden behind every symptom. One can say there is a phobia hidden behind every obsessive compulsive neurosis. And it becomes very transparent and beautiful, and I had occasion to observe such a case for many, many years, who actually entered the analysis during for obsessive compulsive symptoms. She had, however, a history of a transitory attacks, anxiety attacks with certain phobic symptoms at the age around 6. With the progress of the analysis, specifically when she had to face the problem of pregnancy, she developed a full-fledged phobia. And with it, the obsessive-compulsive symptoms went completely into the background. And we analyzed for about 2 to 3 years all the aspects of a phobia, which was claustrophobia, elevator phobia, etc., etc. When the phobia was worked through, then again the whole obsession compulsion neurosis emerged with a great deal of symptoms which were completely egosyntonic, but were not character symptom, but were real full-fledged obsessive compulsive symptom which had existed silently for actually at least 15 years. Now, during the analysis, one could then see beautifully how the phobia replaced obsession neurosis, the phobia went in the background, the obsession neurosis came back, and one had to analyze all those phases back and forth continuously. As far as Miss Balkanyi, I am a little allergic to bringing the term repetition compulsion into the discussion of these phenomena. The tendency for repetitiveness, or the compulsion to repeat, is something which is inherent in every living system. But we don't have to call it repetition compulsion in the sense of Freud's formulation of an overriding regulatory principle of mental functioning. Of course, the lower the organization, the more tendency to repeat and repeat the same things. And children want to repeat things endlessly, but we should not call this repetition compulsion. Thank you very much.
Yes, certainly, Miss Freud.
I think two things. Because they both concern the difference between childhood and adulthood, so far as neurosis is concerned. I think it's absolutely true that every adult obsessional patient has been obsessional already in his childhood. And every adult phobia has had phobic episodes in childhood, but this is not reversible. There are many more childhood phobias and childhood obsessional phenomena than parallel disturbances in adulthood. And I think much confusion is caused by the reversal of what we know from reconstruction in analysis. We can always reconstruct the past of the same kind, but we can't predict it. That's one thing. And the other is a very curious phenomenon which fits with what Dr. Schur said just now. When one analyzes an adult obsessional neurosis, and a very severe adult obsessional neurosis, the next phase one gets to is the phobic phase. And we know that this is a very good sign. We've gone behind it. But when you have a child with a real infantile obsessional neurosis in analysis, let us say a child of 5 or 6, what you get next in analysis, and very soon, is not a phobia. You get an impulsive character. And if you asked an adult analyst, how long will it take you in analysis to turn your obsessional patient into an impulsive one? You would say, years, if ever. Well, we guarantee in the clinic in a fortnight, if we are not careful. You have to be extremely careful when analyzing an infantile obsessional, because you get the wildest acting out, sadistic and dirty child in no time. And this has always fascinated me, because on the other hand, we see when we study the obsessional neurosis in childhood, the careful build-up, the structures, they look like eternal, they are so well-founded, they remind us so of the adult, but they can also go. And I think that's what the adult analysts are not prepared for these differences, which really means the fluidity. On the one hand, the dependence on the inner change of instinctive development, on the other hand, dependence on the environment.
Well, I want to finish with 2 comments. You must realize this is just the beginning of what we hope will be a long process of research on the subject of obsessional neurosis. When we did this, my colleagues and mine at the clinic felt that this was a job to be done. We have to start with this review of the literature and so on, and with the organization of some of the material that we have had the opportunity to observe, but we are far from satisfied with it. We are just beginning. We hope that things will follow from here. But you will remember that in the program we said there that this is, of course, we hope that this was going to be an exercise in international cooperation, because no institution, certainly no individual, has of necessity cannot have enough experience or cases. And sometimes I feel that if we could keep a channel open for communication between us, we will be able to collect a great deal of material, make it available to each other, and in this way perhaps we will be able to produce some of the answers that Dr. Weissman and Dr. Valenstein and all of us have in mind. So I hope that at least some of you will be encouraged to communicate frequently. Certainly I am a good correspondent, so you will hear from me anyhow, yeah? Thank you very much.